For over 75 years, the security of Europe has been anchored by a single, unwavering promise. An attack on one is an attack on all. This principle, the heart of the NATO alliance, was built on the absolute certainty of American military protection. On February 10, 2024, that certainty was shattered. A statement made at a political rally in South Carolina did more than just create a diplomatic firestorm. It acted as a catalyst, bringing a simmering crisis of trust to a boil, and forcing a continent to question the very foundation of its post-war defense architecture. This is the story of how those words may have set in motion a historic fracture. As an analyst focused on international security structures and military alliances, my role in this breakdown is to serve as an informative guide. The objective here is not to provide opinion or judgment, but to dissect the mechanics of this event with precision. We will examine the established rules of the transatlantic partnership, the institutional realities that govern it, and the tangible consequences now unfolding. The goal is to move beyond the headlines and provide a clear, contextualized understanding of a complex geopolitical shift, based entirely on the factual record and the strategic logic driving the actions of the nations involved. The central thesis of this analysis is that Donald Trump's declaration, conditioning military aid on financial targets and encouraging aggression against certain allies, was not an isolated remark. Instead, it was the specific tipping point that transformed years of simmering doubt into an open and urgent debate. This event forced key European nations to publicly confront a once unthinkable possibility: the need to create their own independent nuclear deterrent. What we are witnessing is not merely a political dispute, but a pragmatic reaction to a perceived breakdown in the most critical security guarantee of the modern era. This moment did not occur in a vacuum. The ground was already fertile for such a crisis. Throughout his first term, Donald Trump consistently questioned the core tenets of NATO, particularly the mutual defense commitment enshrined in Article 5. Simultaneously, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 served as a brutal reminder of Europe's dependence on American military power. This created a paradoxical environment, an alliance militarily stronger and more unified against a common threat, yet politically more fragile than ever, due to profound uncertainty about the reliability of its most powerful member. The fundamental problem we will analyze is how political rhetoric can dismantle the credibility that underpins a military alliance. We will explore the precise mechanisms of NATO's collective defense and the American nuclear umbrella, explaining how they function not as legal mandates, but as instruments of deterrence powered by belief. Then, we will map the institutional gap this event exposed, revealing why Europe currently lacks an alternative. Finally, we will trace the real-world chain reaction, from emergency meetings and policy shifts to the concrete steps now being taken to forge a new path for European security. To follow this detailed examination of the forces reshaping global security, consider subscribing to the channel. Engaging with this analysis by leaving a comment or liking the video helps support the creation of in-depth, fact-based content. Now, to understand the magnitude of the current crisis, we must first deconstruct the foundational pillar that was targeted: NATO's principle of collective defense and the unique role of the American nuclear guarantee. This is where the story truly begins, with the bedrock of an alliance and the nature of its breach. To understand the gravity of the shift now underway, we must first examine the mechanism that was breached. For over 3/4 of a century, European security has rested upon the North Atlantic Treaty, a pact forged in the aftermath of World War II. At its very heart is Article 5, the principle of collective defense. This clause is more than just a line in a document. It is the foundational promise that an armed attack on any member state is an attack on all. This singular commitment has served as the ultimate deterrent against aggression, forming the bedrock upon which the entire transatlantic security architecture was built. Article 5 states that if a NATO ally is the victim of an armed attack, every other member of the alliance will consider this act of violence as an armed attack against all members, and will take the actions it deems necessary to assist the ally attacked. This doesn't mandate an automatic declaration of war, but it does create a binding obligation to respond. The power of this article lies in its unambiguous language, designed to send a clear message to any potential adversary. Confronting one NATO nation means confronting the combined military might of the entire alliance, including its most powerful member. However, the true force of Article 5 has never been purely legal. It has always been political. Its effectiveness as a deterrent is directly proportional to its credibility. An adversary must believe, without a shadow of a doubt, that the alliance's members, particularly the United States, possess the unwavering political will to honor this commitment. Any hesitation, any public questioning of this resolve by a key leader erodes that credibility. The promise is only as strong as the certainty that it will be kept, making political cohesion the invisible but essential fuel that powers the entire defensive engine of the alliance. Layered on top of this conventional military promise is a far more powerful, albeit unwritten, guarantee: the American nuclear umbrella. This is not a formal clause within the North Atlantic Treaty, but a cornerstone of U.S. strategic policy. It is the explicit extension of America's nuclear deterrent to its NATO allies. This policy guarantees that an existential attack on a member state, one that threatens its very survival, could provoke a nuclear response from the United States. This backstop has been the ultimate security assurance for non-nuclear European states, ensuring that no adversary could contemplate a catastrophic attack without risking its own annihilation. This concept is rooted in the logic of nuclear deterrence, a strategic mind game where the primary goal is to prevent conflict before it begins. Deterrence works by ensuring a potential aggressor is absolutely convinced that the cost of an attack will be unacceptably high. The certainty of a devastating response is what maintains the peace. The system is designed to make the potential gains of aggression pale in comparison to the guaranteed catastrophic consequences. For this to function, the threat of retaliation must be both capable and, crucially, completely credible in the eyes of any potential challenger. The nuclear umbrella and Article 5 are inextricably linked. One gives the other its ultimate power. The promise of collective defense under Article 5 is made exponentially more formidable by the implicit backing of the American nuclear arsenal. This linkage means that a major conventional attack on a NATO country like Poland or Estonia carries the inherent risk of escalating into a nuclear conflict with the United States. This calculated ambiguity, the uncertainty of exactly where the nuclear threshold lies, has been a profoundly effective tool for preventing large-scale warfare on the European continent for decades, by making the potential risks of such a conflict simply too high. The statement made on February 10, 2024, did not break a law or formally alter the treaty. Instead, it targeted the most critical component of this entire system: its political credibility. By making the American commitment to defend allies conditional on their defense spending, and by suggesting Russia should do whatever the hell they want to those deemed delinquent, the statement fundamentally changed the nature of the promise. It introduced a transactional logic into a security guarantee that was, for decades, perceived as an absolute and unconditional bond, thereby fracturing the perception of unified resolve. This act effectively shattered the certainty that underpins deterrence. An adversary's strategic calculation is no longer based on the assumption of a guaranteed and unified NATO response. Instead, it now includes a new critical variable: the political mood and transactional assessment of the American president. The question for a potential aggressor shifts from, will the U.S. respond, to, under what specific conditions might the U.S. choose not to respond? This injection of profound doubt is the functional equivalent of breaking the deterrence machine, as it creates ambiguity and perceived opportunities for aggression where none existed before. The structural consequence is that the very bedrock of European defense has been compromised. The political will that animates Article 5 and gives meaning to the nuclear umbrella was publicly and fundamentally questioned by the person who could soon be in sole command of that arsenal. This transformed the security guarantee from a reliable foundational constant into a conditional variable subject to domestic political whims. For European leaders, this was not just a diplomatic incident. It was the moment the ground beneath their feet shifted, revealing a structural vulnerability that demanded an immediate and existential reassessment of their continent's survival strategy. With the credibility of the American guarantee fractured, the focus shifts to the institutional reality it once masked. NATO is not a union of equals. It is a political military alliance built around the asymmetrical power of the United States. While its command structure is integrated, America provides the vast majority of the essential military, logistical, and intelligence capabilities. This dependence is not an accident, but a core feature of the post-war security order. European nations have structured their defenses around the certainty of this American backbone, creating an institutional reliance that is now a source of profound strategic vulnerability. The operational reality of the alliance highlights this imbalance. From strategic airlift and satellite intelligence to advanced munitions and naval power, the United States provides the enabling infrastructure that allows NATO to function as a cohesive, high-end fighting force. Without these assets, the collective military power of the European members would be significantly diminished and far less integrated. This deep-seated reliance means that any wavering of American commitment is not just a political problem. It is an existential threat to the operational viability of the entire collective defense system as it is currently constructed. This dependency is most absolute when it comes to the ultimate deterrent. While NATO is often described as a nuclear alliance, the decision to use the American nuclear arsenal rests solely and exclusively with the President of the United States. There is no collective NATO button. This authority is a sovereign national power, not a shared alliance responsibility. European leaders have always understood this, but they operated on the foundational belief that an American president's strategic interests would align with their continent's survival. The recent statements have replaced that belief with the stark reality of unilateral presidential discretion. In the face of this reality, attention turns to the European Union's own security architecture, known as the Common Security and Defense Policy, or CSDP. However, this framework was never designed to be a substitute for NATO. It is a nascent structure, focused primarily on crisis management, peacekeeping, and smaller-scale operations, not large-scale collective defense against a peer adversary. The CSDP lacks a unified military force comparable to NATO's integrated command, and its decision-making processes are built on consensus among member states, making swift, decisive action a significant institutional challenge. The most critical institutional gap is the absence of a European nuclear capacity. The European Union as an entity possesses no nuclear weapons. The security of the continent has been outsourced to the American nuclear umbrella for over 7 decades. This has created a situation where the EU has immense economic and political power, but remains a strategic dependent in the realm of high-stakes security. The sudden, perceived withdrawal of the American guarantee exposes this void not as a policy choice, but as a critical and urgent structural deficiency that must now be addressed. Within this framework, only one EU member state possesses an independent nuclear arsenal: France, with its force de frappe. The United Kingdom, another European nuclear power, is now outside the European Union. The French deterrent was developed specifically to ensure national autonomy and was never intended to cover the entire continent. Its doctrine, command, and control are strictly national. Therefore, the debate about a European nuclear shield is not about activating an existing system, but about attempting to create a completely new and historically unprecedented one, centered on a French asset designed for a different purpose. This challenge immediately raises enormous institutional hurdles, the most significant being the question of political control. Who would have the authority to launch a nuclear strike on behalf of 27 member states? Would that power reside with France, a committee of leaders, or an EU institution? A nuclear deterrent requires a clear, credible, and rapid chain of command. Reconciling the sovereign authority required for nuclear decision-making with the consensus-based nature of the European Union presents a political and legal puzzle of immense complexity. one for which no easy answer or existing model is available. Beyond the issue of command and control lies the challenge of financing and strategic alignment. A credible nuclear deterrent is astronomically expensive to maintain and modernize. Who would pay for the Europeanization of the French arsenal, and how would those costs be distributed? Furthermore, how could the diverse national security interests of nations from Portugal to Finland be unified into a single coherent nuclear doctrine? An attack on Warsaw might not be perceived as the same level of existential threat in Lisbon, creating potential fault lines in the very commitment a shared deterrent is meant to solidify. Ultimately, the institutional gap is a chasm. On one side, there is a long-standing but now unreliable system where ultimate power rests with a single external actor. On the other, there is a collection of sovereign European nations, lacking the unified military structures, a shared nuclear capacity, and the cohesive political will to quickly forge an alternative. This void is the direct consequence of decades of reliance on a security guarantee that was assumed to be permanent. The frantic debate now underway is the sound of a continent scrambling to build a new security architecture in real time. The breakdown of perceived American reliability has triggered immediate and concrete consequences, moving the issue of European security from theoretical debate to urgent action. The most direct outcome is a continent-wide surge in defense spending. For many nations, the long-debated 2% of GDP target is no longer a ceiling to be reached, but a floor to be surpassed. This is not merely about placating an ally. It is now viewed as a national insurance policy against abandonment. The flow of capital into military modernization, munitions production, and force readiness is the first tangible sign of Europe preparing for a future where it may have to stand alone. Beyond budgetary increases, the political rhetoric has translated into formal diplomatic and military consultations. High-level officials from Germany, France, and Poland have publicly initiated discussions on nuclear cooperation, transforming a once taboo topic into a central pillar of security strategy. These are no longer abstract conversations about strategic autonomy, but practical meetings exploring the mechanics of a shared deterrent. The speed at which these talks materialized underscores the severity of the perceived crisis. European leaders are now actively mapping out contingency plans for a security landscape in which the American guarantee is no longer a given, but a variable. At the heart of these discussions are several potential models for a European nuclear shield. The most prominent proposal involves Europeanizing France's independent nuclear arsenal, the force de frappe. Under this framework, Paris would formally extend its nuclear guarantee to cover other EU members. In return, participating nations would contribute financially to the immense cost of maintaining and modernizing the deterrent, and they would also grant France the political buy-in required for such a monumental strategic shift. This model represents a historic challenge, attempting to align a strictly national asset with a collective European security interest. Alongside the French-centric model, other options are being actively explored. One alternative involves developing a completely new command and control structure within the European Union, a far more complex and politically ambitious undertaking. Another, more immediate strategy is the strengthening of bilateral and regional defense pacts between European nations. This creates a patchwork of smaller, interlocking security guarantees intended to build redundancy and resilience. The simultaneous exploration of these different paths reveals a continent grappling with its new reality, uncertain of the final destination, but resolute in its search for a viable alternative to the old order. These actions collectively represent a fundamental paradigm shift in European security. For over 75 years, the continent's defense has been a project of transatlantic integration, organized and ultimately guaranteed by American leadership. That era may be ending. The current scramble for self-reliance is forcing Europe to redefine its security identity, moving from a position of strategic dependence to one of autonomous survival. This transformation is not a choice but a necessity, driven by the realization that the foundational assumptions of the post-war era have been irrevocably fractured. demanding a new strategic calculus. This shift inevitably creates new power dynamics within Europe itself. As the only EU member with an independent nuclear arsenal, France finds itself at the center of these critical negotiations, elevating its strategic importance. Germany, with its economic might, is the indispensable financial partner in any such endeavor. This Franco-German axis becomes the core of Europe's new security calculus. Furthermore, this could lead to the emergence of a two-speed alliance, a core group of nations integrated under a potential European nuclear shield, and others on the periphery who continue to bet exclusively on a now questionable American commitment. In essence, the statement made at a political rally did not create the mistrust within the alliance. It acted as the specific catalyst that exposed a fault line already present. This event connected the broken mechanism of deterrence, explained in our first segment, with the stark institutional void detailed in the second. The shattering of credibility forced a direct confrontation with Europe's lack of a self-sufficient security apparatus. The real-world consequences we now observe, the spending surges, the nuclear talks, and the strategic realignment, are the logical and pragmatic outcomes of that confrontation. The most profound and lasting impact, regardless of any future U.S. election outcome, is the structural erosion of mutual trust. This intangible asset is the true bedrock of any military alliance, and once it is heavily damaged, it becomes incredibly difficult to rebuild. The certainty of an unconditional American guarantee has been replaced by a deep and persistent doubt. This lingering uncertainty will now be a permanent factor in the strategic calculations of both European allies and their potential adversaries, fundamentally altering the transatlantic relationship for a generation. Even if political rhetoric were to soften tomorrow, what we are witnessing is the potential unraveling of a security order that has defined the Western world since the end of World War II. This process demonstrates that the global security architecture is not a permanent fixture, but a fragile construct susceptible to the domestic politics of its most powerful members. The key takeaway is that a single statement can accelerate history, forcing entire continents to reevaluate their most fundamental strategies for survival in real time. The full consequences of this historic fracture are still unfolding, marking the beginning of a new, more uncertain chapter for Europe and the world.